The crack of gunfire split the air as Rebecca Miller pressed her back against the weathered wood of the abandoned stagecoach station, the cold metal barrel of a bandit's revolver pressing against her temple. Her heart hammered wildly in her chest, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps as she stared into the cruel eyes of the man who would likely be her executioner. She had never imagined her journey west would end like this alone and terrified in the vast, unforgiving landscape of the Arizona Territory in 1878. "Hand over the satchel, pretty lady," the bandit growled, his tobacco-stained teeth bared in a sinister grin. "Or I'll paint these walls with what's inside that pretty head of yours." Rebecca's fingers tightened around the leather bag containing the last of her family's money funds meant to start her new life. Death seemed certain either way. These men weren't known for leaving witnesses. The leader of the gang stepped forward, his spurs jingling with each menacing step. "I'm growing impatient, miss." 3 seconds before, the thunderous report of a rifle cut off his words. The bandit holding Rebecca jerked backward, a bloom of crimson spreading across his filthy shirt as he crumpled to the ground. Before the others could react, 2 more shots rang out in rapid succession. Bodies fell. Confusion erupted. Through the settling dust and gun smoke, a lone figure on horseback emerged. Tall and imposing against the setting sun, the stranger's rifle still raised and steady. Time seemed to slow as the remaining bandits scrambled for cover. "Madam," the deep voice called out, "when I say now, you run to me." Another shot, another bandit down. Now, Rebecca didn't hesitate. She gathered her skirts and ran, bullets kicking up dirt at her heels. As she reached the horseman, a strong arm hooked around her waist, lifting her effortlessly onto the saddle in front of him. The powerful horse beneath them reared before launching into a gallop, carrying them away from the bloodshed and into the vast expanse of the desert as the sun dipped below the horizon. Safety came in the form of a stranger whose face she hadn't even properly seen. All Rebecca knew was that the steady heartbeat against her back belonged to the man who had just saved her life. "Hold tight," he instructed, his breath warm against her ear as they rode into the gathering darkness. Rebecca clung to the saddle horn, the rhythm of the horse's hooves matching her still racing heart. She had no idea who this cowboy was or where he was taking her, but for now she was alive, and that was enough. The moon climbed higher in the vast desert sky as they rode, casting silvery light across the rugged landscape. Rebecca's initial terror had faded to a dull throb of fear mixed with exhaustion. They had been riding for what felt like hours, putting considerable distance between themselves and the bandits. Finally, the cowboy slowed their mount to a walk. "Need to rest the horse," he said, his voice low and graveled. "There's a creek up ahead where we can stop for a spell." Rebecca nodded, though he couldn't see her face. Her body ached from the hard ride, her hands cramped from gripping the saddle horns so tightly. When they reached the small creek, bordered by a cluster of cottonwoods, the stranger dismounted in one fluid motion before reaching up to help her down. For the first time, Rebecca got a clear look at her rescuer in the moonlight. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a strong, weathered face that spoke of years under the sun. Dark hair fell to his collar beneath a dust-covered hat, and his eyes, a striking shade of gray, assessed her with careful concern. "You hurt?" he asked, his gaze sweeping over her for signs of injury. "No," Rebecca answered, her voice barely above a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again. "No, I'm not hurt, thanks to you, Mr. Hawkins, Hayes Hawkins." He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect. "And you are Rebecca Miller?" She smoothed down her skirt, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must look. "I'm in your debt, Mr. Hawkins." "Those men would have killed me if you hadn't intervened." Hayes nodded once, then turned to tend to his horse. "The Barrow gang has been terrorizing these parts for months, robbing stagecoaches, homesteaders, lone travelers." He loosened the cinch on his saddle to give the animal some relief. "What were you doing out there alone, Miss Miller? These lands aren't safe for solitary travel, especially for a woman." Rebecca bristled slightly at his tone but couldn't deny the truth of his words. "I was supposed to meet the westbound stage at that station." The driver of the wagon that brought me said it would arrive by sundown. She sighed, pushing a strand of auburn hair from her face. Obviously, it never came. Hayes led his horse to the creek to drink. Stage was probably delayed. Or the driver heard about Barrow's men in the area and changed the route. He glanced back at her. "Where were you headed?" "Tucson," Rebecca replied, taking a tentative step toward the water. Her throat was parched from dust and fear. "My uncle owns a general store there. He's offered me a position after." She trailed off, not wanting to divulge too much of her personal history to this stranger, regardless of how he'd saved her life. Something in Hayes's expression softened. "After what?" Rebecca knelt by the creek, cupping her hands to collect water. "After my parents died. Influenza took them both last winter." She drank deeply, the cool water a blessing on her dry throat. "There was nothing left for me in Chicago." Hayes was quiet for a moment, allowing her this small privacy of grief. "I'm sorry for your loss," he finally said, his voice gentler than before. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small tin cup, offering it to her. "Use this, it's cleaner than your hands." She accepted the cup with a grateful nod. "Thank you for everything." As Rebecca drank, Hayes surveyed their surroundings, his posture alert despite his seemingly relaxed demeanor. "We'll rest here for an hour, then keep moving. Those that survived back there might come looking, though I doubt they'd be that stupid." "Where are we going?" Rebecca asked, suddenly realizing she had no idea where this man was taking her. "My ranch is about 4 hours' ride southwest of here. We'll be safe there for the night, and tomorrow I can take you into Tucson." He untied a bedroll from behind his saddle and laid it on the ground. "You should rest while you can, Miss Miller. It'll be a long ride yet." Rebecca hesitated, eyeing the bedroll. Despite his heroics, Hayes Hawkins was still a stranger, a man she knew nothing about beyond his name and the fact that he was handy with a rifle. "Mr. Hawkins, while I appreciate your assistance, I'm not certain it would be proper for me to, Madam," Hayes interrupted, a hint of amusement crossing his features. "I'm offering you the bedroll. I'll be keeping watch." He gestured to a fallen log nearby, "Over there." Embarrassment colored Rebecca's cheeks. "Oh, I didn't mean to imply, no offense taken." He tipped his hat slightly. "Get some rest, Miss Miller. Dawn comes early in these parts." Rebecca settled onto the bedroll, her body suddenly aware of how exhausted she truly was. As her eyes grew heavy, she watched Hayes Hawkins through half-closed lids. He sat on the log, rifle across his knees, silhouette strong and vigilant against the starlit sky. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was that there were still good men in this world, even in the wild, untamed territory of Arizona. True to his word, Hayes woke her after an hour. The moon had shifted position in the night sky, and a chill had settled over the desert. Rebecca rose stiffly, her body protesting the brief respite on the hard ground. "Here," Hayes said, holding out a worn but clean blanket. "Wrap this around your shoulders. Desert gets cold at night." Rebecca accepted the blanket gratefully, pulling it tight around her. "Thank you." They rode in silence for most of the journey. The rhythmic sound of hoofbeats and the occasional call of a night bird the only sounds accompanying them. Rebecca found herself leaning back against Hayes's solid chest as fatigue set in again, his arm occasionally tightening around her waist to keep her steady. "Almost there," he murmured after what seemed like an eternity. Dawn was just beginning to break on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. As the light grew stronger, Rebecca could make out a modest ranch house nestled against a backdrop of rocky hills. A barn and corral stood nearby, and a small garden was visible to one side of the main house. It wasn't grand, but it looked well-maintained and inviting after their long night ride. Hayes guided his horse to the front of the house and dismounted before helping Rebecca down. Her legs nearly buckled beneath her, numb from the long hours in the saddle. "Easy," Hayes said, his strong hands steadying her at the waist. "Legs'll wake up in a minute." Before Rebecca could respond, the front door of the ranch house swung open and an older man with a shock of white hair stepped out, shotgun in hand. "That you, Hayes?" The man called, squinting in the early morning light. "It's me, Silas," Hayes responded, keeping one hand on Rebecca's elbow as she found her footing. Put the shotgun away, we've got company. Silas lowered the weapon, his weathered face breaking into a curious smile as he approached. Well now, this is unexpected. Who might this young lady be? Rebecca Miller, Hayes answered, leading her toward the house. Miss Miller, this is Silas Cooper, my ranch foreman and the closest thing to a father I've got left in this world. Silas tipped his hat. Pleasure to meet you, Miss Miller, though I suspect there's quite a story behind your arrival. There is, Hayes confirmed, and we'll tell it over breakfast. Miss Miller's had a rough night. I imagine so, Silas replied, eyeing her dusty, travel-worn appearance with sympathy rather than judgment. Come on in, miss. We ain't got much in the way of fancy comforts, but there's hot coffee and I can rustle up some eggs and biscuits. The interior of the ranch house was simple but comfortable. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, with well-worn furniture arranged for conversation. Bookshelves lined another wall, surprisingly full for a remote ranch house. The place had a lived-in feel, not meticulously tidy, but clean and orderly in a masculine way. Sit yourself down, Silas gestured to a chair at the wooden table. I'll get that coffee. As Rebecca sank gratefully into the chair, Hayes disappeared down a hallway, returning moments later with a clean towel and a basin of water. Thought you might want to freshen up, he said, placing them on the table beside her. The simple kindness nearly brought tears to her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. While Silas busied himself at the iron stove and Hayes stepped outside to tend to his horse, Rebecca used the cool water to wash the dust from her face and hands. Her reflection in the small mirror hanging on the wall revealed a young woman she barely recognized, auburn hair tumbling from its once neat arrangement, green eyes shadowed with exhaustion, and a smudge of dirt still visible along her jawline. She did her best to tidy her appearance before the men returned. Over a hearty breakfast of scrambled eggs, biscuits, and strong coffee, Hayes recounted their encounter with the Barrow gang. Silas listened intently, his weathered face growing increasingly troubled. Sounds like you were mighty lucky, Miss Miller, Silas said when Hayes finished the tale. And fortunate that Hayes happened to be tracking those vermin. Rebecca looked up sharply. Tracking them? You mean you were hunting these men deliberately? Hayes met her questioning gaze steadily. I was. The territorial marshal deputized me 2 months ago to help bring in Barrow and his gang. They've killed 3 settlers and a mail carrier since spring. You're a lawman. Rebecca set down her coffee cup, reassessing the quiet, capable man before her. Not exactly, Hayes replied. I ranch and raise horses for a living, but I know this territory better than most, and Marshal Jenkins is spread thin with only 2 deputies to cover hundreds of miles. Silas chuckled. What Hayes isn't telling you is that he was an army scout during the Apache campaigns. Knows tracking and shooting better than any man I've met, including my time with the Texas Rangers. Hayes shot Silas a look that suggested he'd prefer less elaboration on his background, but the older man merely shrugged and continued eating his breakfast. Well, Rebecca said after a moment, whatever your official capacity, Mr. Hawkins, I'm grateful you were there. Hayes nodded in acknowledgement. After you've rested, Miss Miller, I'll take you into Tucson. Your uncle will be worried when you don't arrive on the stage. Thank you, Rebecca said, stifling a yawn. Now that she was safe, warm, and fed, exhaustion was overwhelming her. Silas stood, gathering the empty plates. I've made up the spare room for you, miss. It ain't fancy, but the sheets are clean and you'll have privacy. That's very kind of you both, Rebecca managed, fighting to keep her eyes open. Hayes rose from the table. Come on, I'll show you to the room. You need sleep more than anything right now. The spare room was small but neat, with a narrow bed, a simple wooden chest of drawers, and a window overlooking the corral. Hayes stood awkwardly in the doorway as Rebecca surveyed her temporary accommodation. There's water in the pitcher, he said, nodding toward a ceramic basin on the dresser. And I'll see if I can find something for you to change into. Might have some of my mother's things stored away still. Rebecca turned to face him, suddenly aware of how close they were standing in the small doorway. His height forced her to tilt her head back to meet his gaze, and for a moment neither spoke. There was something in his gray eyes, a quiet intensity that made her heart beat a little faster. "Thank you, Mr. Hawkins," she finally said, her voice softer than intended, "for everything." Hayes cleared his throat and stepped back, breaking the moment. "Get some rest, Miss Miller. We'll head to Tucson this afternoon if you're feeling up to it." With that, he closed the door, leaving Rebecca alone with her thoughts and a strange, fluttering sensation in her chest that had nothing to do with her recent brush with death. Rebecca slept deeply, undisturbed by dreams or the usual sounds of ranch life that filtered through the window. When she finally awoke, the sun was high in the sky, suggesting it was well past noon. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then the events of the previous night came rushing back: the bandits, the gunfire, the desperate ride through the darkness with a stranger's arms around her. A soft knock at the door roused her fully. "Miss Miller, are you awake?" It was Silas's voice, gentle but clear. "Yes, I'm awake," she called back, sitting up and smoothing her wrinkled dress as best she could. "Found some clothes that might fit you," Silas said through the door. "Hayes dug them out of an old trunk. I'll leave them outside your door, and there's hot water for washing up when you're ready." "Thank you, Mr. Cooper. I'll be out shortly." After Silas's footsteps retreated, Rebecca retrieved the bundle from the hallway, a simple calico dress in a faded blue pattern, along with undergarments and a shawl. The clothes were dated in style but clean and in good condition. She wondered briefly about the woman who had worn them before, Hayes's mother perhaps, but didn't dwell on it as she gratefully changed out of her dusty, travel-worn attire. The dress was a reasonable fit, if a bit loose around the waist and shoulders. Rebecca used the pitcher and basin to wash thoroughly, then did her best to arrange her hair with only her fingers as a comb. When she finally emerged from the room, she felt refreshed despite the lingering fatigue in her bones. She found Hayes alone in the main room, seated at a table with maps and papers spread before him. He looked up as she entered, and for a brief moment, something like appreciation flickered in his eyes before his expression returned to its usual reserve. "The clothes suit you," he said, standing as she approached. "They were my mother's from before she passed." Rebecca smoothed the skirt self-consciously. "They're perfect. Please thank you for lending them to me." Hayes nodded, his gaze lingering on her face. "You look rested. How do you feel?" "Much better, thank you." She glanced around the room. "Where is Mr. Cooper?" Silas rode out to check on the herd and inform our ranch hands about the Barrow gang being in the area. Hayes began rolling up the maps on the table. "I thought we'd head to Tucson after you've had something to eat." "It's about a 2-hour ride." Rebecca moved closer to the table, catching glimpses of the maps before Hayes could put them away. They were detailed drawings of the surrounding territory, with markings and notations that appeared to track movements of some kind. "You're really serious about hunting these bandits," she observed. Hayes's expression hardened slightly. "They've terrorized this territory long enough, the marshals offering a substantial reward, but that's not why I'm involved." He paused, seeming to debate whether to continue. "They killed a family last month, mother, father, and their teenage son. The only survivor was a 7-year-old girl who hid in a root cellar. She walked 15 miles to the nearest homestead for help." Rebecca felt her throat tighten at the story. "That's horrific." "Yes," Hayes agreed grimly. "It is, and it's why Barrow and his men need to be stopped." An uncomfortable silence fell between them, broken only when Hayes cleared his throat and gestured toward the kitchen. "There's stew keeping warm on the stove. You should eat before we ride." While Rebecca ate the hearty beef stew, Hayes prepared for their journey, gathering supplies and saddling 2 horses, his own sturdy gelding and a gentle mare for Rebecca. By the time she had finished her meal and cleaned her bowl, everything was ready for their departure. "Ever ridden before?" Hayes asked as he helped her mount the mare. "A little," Rebecca admitted. "We kept a horse in Chicago, but riding in the city is quite different from the open country, I imagine." Hayes adjusted the stirrups for her. "Daisy here is even-tempered. She'll follow my horse without much guidance. Just hold the reins loosely and move with her gait." The ride to Tucson was mostly silent, each lost in their own thoughts as they traveled across the sun-baked landscape. Occasionally, Hayes would point out landmarks or name distant mountain ranges, his deep voice carrying easily on the desert air. Rebecca found herself studying his profile when he wasn't looking, the strong line of his jaw, the way the sun brought out hints of amber in his otherwise dark hair, the tiny scar that cut through his right eyebrow. "Something wrong, Miss Miller?" Hayes asked without turning his head, apparently sensing her scrutiny. Rebecca felt heat rise in her cheeks at being caught staring. "Not at all. I was just wondering what brought you to Arizona territory. You don't sound like you're from here originally." Hayes was quiet for so long that Rebecca thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "I came west with the army after the war between the states, served as a scout like Silas mentioned. When I mustered out, I had no reason to go back east. Everything I'd known was gone." The simple statement held volumes of unspoken history. Rebecca sensed there was much more to Hayes Hawkins than he was sharing, but she didn't press. Everyone had their stories, their reasons for seeking a fresh start in the Western Territories. She certainly had hers. And the ranch. She asked instead, "Won it in a poker game," Hayes said, a hint of amusement in his voice. Previous owner was more fond of cards and whiskey than raising cattle. Place was run down, barely surviving. Silas was the only hand who stayed on after I took over. Together, we built it into something worthwhile. Pride colored his words, and Rebecca could understand why. Building something from nothing in this harsh landscape took determination and grit, qualities Hayes Hawkins seemed to possess in abundance. As they crested a rise, the town of Tucson spread out before them, a collection of adobe buildings, wooden structures, and tents sprawling along the Santa Cruz River. Church spires rose alongside saloon signs, and the newly built railroad station bustled with activity at the edge of town. "There it is," Hayes said. "Not the grandest city in the territory, but it's growing fast since the railroad came through. Where did you say your uncle's store was located?" "Congress Street, near the plaza," Rebecca replied, anxiety suddenly fluttering in her stomach. After everything that had happened, the prospect of finally reaching her destination and facing an uncle she hadn't seen since childhood felt overwhelming. Hayes seemed to sense her apprehension. "Your uncle's a good man." "I believe so," Rebecca said. "He wrote regularly to my mother over the years, and his letters after their passing were very kind. I don't know him well, but he's my only remaining family." Hayes nodded. "Then he'll be glad to see you safe, no matter the circumstances of your arrival." He guided his horse toward town, adding over his shoulder, "And if he's not, you come find me. I'll set him straight." The unexpected protectiveness in his voice warmed something in Rebecca's chest. She followed him down the dusty road into Tucson, uncertain what awaited her, but feeling, for the first time since leaving Chicago, that perhaps everything would be all right after all. Miller's General Merchandise stood on a prime corner of Congress Street, its large display windows showcasing everything from tools and dry goods to fabric and housewares. A bell jangled overhead as Hayes held the door for Rebecca to enter, the familiar smells of coffee, leather, and spices washing over her. The store was busy with late afternoon customers, and for a moment no one paid them any attention. "Can I help you folks?" A middle-aged man with spectacles perched on his nose approached, wiping his hands on a shop apron. "I'm looking for Thomas Miller," Rebecca said, her voice steadier than she expected. The man's expression shifted from polite inquiry to surprise. "I'm Thomas Miller, and who might you be, miss?" "Uncle Thomas, it's Rebecca, Elizabeth's daughter." She stepped forward, suddenly conscious of her borrowed dress and travel-worn appearance. "I was supposed to arrive on yesterday's stage from Benson." Thomas Miller's face paled slightly, and he reached out to grasp the edge of a nearby counter. "Rebecca, good Lord, child, we'd given you up for lost. Word came that the stage never made it to the way station, and when you weren't on this morning's coach either." He trailed off, looking past her to Hayes. "Who's this man?" Hayes touched the brim of his hat respectfully. "Hayes Hawkins, sir." "I found your niece being held at gunpoint by the Barrow gang at the abandoned station. Managed to get her away safely." Thomas's expression cycled rapidly through shock, horror, and profound relief. "The Barrow gang, my God, Rebecca." He moved forward and embraced her tightly. I should never have arranged for you to travel that route. The marshal warned us last week about increased bandit activity, but I thought. He pulled back, examining her face. Are you hurt? Did they harm you? I'm fine, Uncle, Rebecca assured him, blinking back unexpected tears at the genuine concern in his voice. Mr. Hawkins arrived just in time. He saved my life. Thomas turned to Hayes, extending his hand. Mr. Hawkins, I can't begin to thank you enough. Whatever reward you're seeking, no reward necessary, Mr. Miller, Hayes interrupted, shaking the offered hand firmly. Just doing what any decent man would. Then at least stay for dinner, Thomas insisted. My wife Martha will want to thank you personally once I tell her what's happened. We live above the store, he added, gesturing toward a staircase at the back. Hayes hesitated, glancing at Rebecca. Something passed between them, an unspoken recognition that their brief but intense shared experience was coming to an end. The thought brought an unexpected pang of sadness to Rebecca's heart. I should report to the marshal about the gang's whereabouts, Hayes said after a moment, but I could return later if the invitation still stands. Of course it does, Thomas assured him. We dine at 7. And the marshal's office is just 2 blocks down across from the courthouse. Hayes nodded, his gaze returning to Rebecca. Miss Miller, I'm glad you're safely with family now. Rebecca stepped forward, suddenly reluctant to see him leave. Mr. Hawkins, Hayes. I don't know how to properly thank you. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. No thanks needed, I'm just glad I was there. He touched his hat brim again. Until this evening, then. As Hayes turned to leave, Rebecca felt as though something important was walking out the door with him. It was ridiculous, of course. She barely knew the man. And yet, in the span of less than a day, he had saved her life, shown her kindness, and stirred feelings she hadn't expected to experience in the aftermath of such terror. Rebecca, her uncle's voice brought her attention back to the present. Let me close up the shop early and take you upstairs to meet your aunt. She's been worried sick since we heard about the stage. Rebecca nodded, forcing herself to focus on the family reunion ahead rather than the departing figure of Hayes Hawkins. She had reached her destination safely, the new beginning she had traveled so far to find. It was time to embrace it, regardless of the unexpected complications her harrowing journey had introduced to her heart. Upstairs, Martha Miller proved to be a warm, motherly woman who fussed over Rebecca with genuine concern. After hearing a condensed version of Rebecca's ordeal, she insisted on preparing a hot bath and lending Rebecca some of her own clothes until they could retrieve Rebecca's trunk from the stage office. The poor dear, Martha said to her husband as Rebecca soaked in the copper tub behind a privacy screen in their spare bedroom. To think what might have happened if that cowboy hadn't come along. Indeed, Thomas agreed, his voice carrying from the doorway where he stood speaking with his wife. I've heard of this Hawkins fellow before, keeps to himself mostly but has a solid reputation, raises some of the finest horses in the territory from what I understand. Well, he's welcome at our table anytime after what he did, Martha declared, and he's coming to dinner, you say? I invited him, yes, said he needed to speak with the marshal first. Their voices faded as they moved away from the door, leaving Rebecca alone with her thoughts and the soothing warm water. She tried to focus on the blessing of having arrived safely, of her uncle and aunt's warm welcome, of the new life stretching before her. But her mind kept returning to Hayes Hawkins, to the steadiness of his presence during their desperate ride, to the gentleness beneath his stoic exterior, to the way his gray eyes had held hers in those quiet moments at the ranch. It was foolish, she knew. Gratitude and admiration were natural after being rescued, but anything beyond that was surely a product of the intensity of their shared experience. Once normal life resumed, these unexpected feelings would fade. They had to. By the time Rebecca emerged from her bath, dressed in one of her aunt's simpler dresses that had been hastily altered to better fit her smaller frame, she had convinced herself that dinner would be a perfectly ordinary affair. She would thank Hayes Hawkins properly for his heroism, wish him well, and focus on settling into her new life in Tucson. But when 7 o'clock arrived and a knock sounded at the miller's door, Rebecca's carefully constructed composure wavered. Hayes stood in the doorway, hat in hand, his dark hair combed neatly and his trail dust gone. He changed into a clean shirt and vest, though he still wore his trail-worn pants and boots. The transformation wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to make Rebecca's breath catch slightly. "Mr. Hawkins," Thomas greeted warmly, ushering him inside. "Welcome, welcome. This is my wife, Martha." Hayes shook Martha's hand with a respectful nod. "Madam, thank you for the invitation." "It's we who should be thanking you," Martha replied, her expression earnest. "You brought our Rebecca safely to us when we feared the worst." Hayes's gaze found Rebecca then, standing slightly behind her aunt. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, at seeing her transformed from the dusty, frightened woman he'd rescued. "Miss Miller," he said softly. "You're looking well." "Thank you," Rebecca managed, acutely aware of her aunt's curious glance between them. "As are you." An awkward moment passed before Thomas clapped his hands together. "Well, Martha has prepared a feast in your honor, Mr. Hawkins. Shall we sit down?" Dinner was a curious affair. Martha had indeed outdone herself, preparing a roast with potatoes and vegetables, fresh bread, and an apple pie for dessert. The conversation flowed more easily than Rebecca had expected, with Hayes answering Thomas's questions about his ranch and his time as an Army scout with surprising openness. He spoke knowledgeably about the territory, offering insights about everything from water rights to Apache relations that revealed a thoughtful, educated mind behind his frontier demeanor. "The territorial governor has the right idea about negotiating with Victorio's band," Hayes was saying as Martha served the pie. "Fighting has cost too many lives on both sides. The reservation system needs reform, not more military action." Thomas nodded in agreement. "Refreshing to hear such a balanced view. Too many settlers want nothing but extermination, not understanding that most Apache just want to live peacefully on their ancestral lands." "People fear what they don't understand," Hayes replied, his gaze briefly meeting Rebecca's across the table. "It takes time and effort to see beyond that fear." Rebecca found herself wondering how many layers there were to Hayes Hawkins, and how little she truly knew about the man who had saved her life. Each revelation only heightened her curiosity and, she had to admit, her attraction. "What did the marshal say about the Barrow gang?" Thomas asked, changing the subject. Hayes set down his fork. "He's organizing a posse to ride out tomorrow. I'll be joining them. With luck, we'll catch the survivors before they can regroup and cause more harm." "You're riding out with the posse." Rebecca couldn't keep the concern from her voice. "Isn't that dangerous?" Hayes's expression softened slightly at her obvious worry. "It's necessary, Miss Miller. I know where they were last, and I'm one of the best trackers in the territory. The marshal needs my help." "Of course," Rebecca said quickly, embarrassed by her outburst. After everything that happened." "I understand," Hayes said quietly, "but this is something I need to do." The conversation moved on to lighter topics, but a new tension had entered the room. When dinner concluded, Thomas invited Hayes to stay for coffee, but the cowboy declined politely. "Need to prepare for an early start tomorrow," he explained, rising from the table. "Mrs. Miller, that was the finest meal I've had in months, thank you." Martha beamed at the compliment. "You're welcome back anytime, Mr. Hawkins. Especially after the posse returned successfully and safely," she added with meaning. Thomas walked Hayes to the door, engaged in conversation about local politics, while Martha began clearing the table. Rebecca hesitated, then followed the men, unwilling to let Hayes leave without a proper goodbye. At the door, Thomas shook Hayes's hand vigorously. "Godspeed tomorrow, Mr. Hawkins, and remember you have friends here now." "I appreciate that, Mr. Miller." Hayes placed his hat on his head, then noticed Rebecca hovering nearby. "Miss Miller," he acknowledged with a nod. Thomas glanced between them, then cleared his throat. "I'll just help Martha with those dishes. Take your time saying goodbye, Rebecca." With surprising tact, he retreated to the kitchen, leaving them alone in the small entryway. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Rebecca stepped forward. "I wanted to thank you again, Mr. Hawkins Hayes. What you did for me, I'll never forget it." Hayes studied her face, his expression unreadable. Anyone would have done the same. We both know that's not true, Rebecca countered softly. You risked your life for a stranger, that's extraordinary. He shifted slightly, uncomfortable with her praise. I should go. Yes, I suppose you should. Rebecca hesitated, then impulsively reached out to touch his arm. Please be careful tomorrow. The Barrow gang is dangerous, as we both know all too well. Hayes looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then back to her face. Something changed in his expression, a softening, a moment of vulnerability breaking through his careful reserve. I'll be careful, he promised, his voice low. Rebecca withdrew her hand, suddenly aware of how forward her gesture had been. Good, that's good. Hayes reached for the door handle, then paused. Rebecca, he said, using her given name for the first time. When this is over, after we've caught Barrow and his men, would you allow me to call on you properly? The question caught her completely off guard. Call on me. To visit, Hayes clarified, a hint of uncertainty in his usually confident demeanor. To get to know you better under less dramatic circumstances. A warm flush spread through Rebecca's chest. I would like that very much, she answered honestly. Hayes nodded, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. Then I have something to look forward to. He opened the door, tipping his hat one final time. Good night, Rebecca. Good night, Hayes, she replied softly, watching as he descended the stairs and disappeared into the gathering darkness of Tucson's evening streets. Rebecca closed the door and leaned against it, her heart racing with an emotion she wasn't ready to name. Whatever this feeling was, this connection that had formed so quickly and unexpectedly, it both thrilled and terrified her. One thing was certain. Her new life in Arizona territory had begun in a way she never could have imagined, and Hayes Hawkins had become an integral part of it, whether she had planned for such a complication or not. The following days passed in a strange mixture of normalcy and anxious waiting. Rebecca began learning the operations of her uncle's store, grateful for the distraction of inventory lists and customer interactions. Thomas proved to be a patient teacher, and Rebecca quickly discovered she had a knack for retail, her friendly demeanor and eye for display drawing increased female patronage to the establishment. But beneath this productive facade, Rebecca's thoughts repeatedly turned to Hayes and the posse. No news had reached town regarding their progress or safety, and each passing day without word heightened her concern. She found herself watching the door whenever the shop bell jangled, hoping to see Hayes's tall figure entering and trying not to show her disappointment when it was yet another regular customer instead. You're fretting again, Martha observed on the fourth afternoon, catching Rebecca rearranging the same display of ribbons for the third time. He'll come back when the job is done, dear, Rebecca startled at her aunt's perceptiveness. I'm just concerned about all of them, she said carefully. The Barrow gang is dangerous. Martha's knowing smile suggested she wasn't fooled. Of course, though I notice you don't ask after Marshal Jenkins or Deputy Wilson with quite the same frequency. She patted Rebecca's hand. It's all right to care for him, you know. From what Thomas has learned about Mr. Hawkins, he's a good man with a solid reputation. Rebecca abandoned pretense with a sigh. Is it that obvious? Only to another woman, Martha assured her, lowering her voice as a customer entered the store, and there's nothing wrong with it. You've been through a traumatic experience together. Such things can forge powerful connections. I barely know him, Rebecca confessed. It seems foolish to feel so concerned. The heart rarely consults with reason before choosing its path, Martha replied with a soft laugh. My Thomas and I knew each other precisely 3 weeks before he proposed marriage. That was 26 years ago, and I've never regretted saying yes. Before Rebecca could respond, the shop door burst open and a young boy of about 12 rushed in, his eyes wide with excitement. Mrs. Miller. Miss Miller, he exclaimed breathlessly. The posse is back. They got the Barrow gang. They're bringing them down Main Street to the jail right now. Martha thanked the boy with a penny for his news. Rebecca barely registered the exchange, already untying her shop apron with trembling fingers. Go, Martha said gently. Thomas can mind the store. I'll come with you. They hurried outside to find the streets filling with townspeople, all moving toward Main Street. As they rounded the corner, Rebecca could see the posse riding slowly toward the jailhouse, a group of bedraggled, bound men walking between the horses. Marshal Jenkins led the procession, his face grim but satisfied. Behind him rode several men Rebecca didn't recognize, and then her heart leapt Hayes, his expression severe as he guided his horse beside a particularly dangerous-looking prisoner. "They got them all," someone in the crowd murmured, "even Barrow himself." Indeed, at the center of the group was a tall, bearded man with a bloody bandage wrapped around his head, clearly the leader of the notorious gang. His hateful glare swept the crowd as he stumbled forward, pushed along by the deputies. Rebecca searched Hayes's face for signs of injury but could detect none from this distance. He seemed alert and unharmed, though exhaustion was evident in the set of his shoulders. As though sensing her scrutiny, Hayes glanced toward the gathering crowd, his gaze eventually finding her among the onlookers. For a brief moment, their eyes locked. He gave her a slight nod in acknowledgement, a reassurance before returning his attention to his prisoner. "Thank God," Martha murmured beside her. "They've all returned safely." The procession continued to the jailhouse, where the prisoners were escorted inside to await trial. The crowd began to disperse, their curiosity satisfied and the excitement of the moment fading back to ordinary daily concerns. But Rebecca remained rooted in place, waiting. Eventually, the posse members emerged from the jailhouse, several heading directly to the saloon across the street. Hayes came out last, speaking briefly with the marshal before shaking hands with the other men. When he finally turned and saw Rebecca still waiting, something in his expression softened. He crossed the street toward her, removing his hat as he approached. Up close, Rebecca could see the toll the past days had taken. Stubble shadowed his jaw, dirt and dust clung to his clothes, and weariness lined his face, but his eyes were clear and focused entirely on her. "Miss Miller," he greeted, his voice rough with fatigue. "Mrs. Miller," he added, acknowledging Martha with a respectful nod. "Mr. Hawkins," Martha replied warmly. "We're relieved to see you've returned safely. The whole town will sleep better knowing those criminals are behind bars." "It was a group effort," Hayes said modestly. "The marshal deserves most of the credit." Rebecca found her voice at last. "Were you injured at all?" Hayes shook his head. "Just tired and trail-worn. The gang didn't put up much of a fight once we surrounded them. Most of Barrow's men lost their nerve when they realized they were outnumbered." "That's a blessing," Martha said. She glanced between Hayes and Rebecca, then added, "I should get back to help Thomas with the store. Rebecca, why don't you invite Mr. Hawkins to join us for dinner again tonight? I'm sure he could use a home-cooked meal after such an ordeal." Before Rebecca could formulate a response, Martha was already walking away, leaving them alone in the busy street. "Your aunt is a perceptive woman," Hayes observed, a hint of amusement lightening his tired features. "And not particularly subtle," Rebecca added with a small smile. "But her invitation is genuine. Will you join us for dinner?" Hayes looked down at his trail-worn appearance. "I should clean up first, and honestly, I could use about 12 hours of sleep before I'm fit for proper company." Disappointment flickered through Rebecca, though she understood completely. "Of course, another time then." "How about tomorrow?" Hayes suggested. "I need to speak with the marshal again in the morning about the trial, but I'm free after that. Would you consider taking a walk with me in the afternoon? I could show you some of Tucson beyond the main streets." Rebecca's heart quickened. "I'd like that very much. 3 o'clock I could meet you at your uncle's store." 3 o'clock, she confirmed. Hayes's smile, a real one this time, not the ghost of one she'd glimpsed before, transformed his face entirely. It made him look younger, less guarded. "Until tomorrow, then." Rebecca watched him walk away, a strange mixture of anticipation and nervousness settling in her stomach. Tomorrow, they would spend time together without the backdrop of danger or family observation. Tomorrow, she would begin to discover who Hayes Hawkins truly was beyond the brave cowboy who had saved her life. And perhaps she would also begin to understand the powerful, unexpected feelings he stirred within her. True to his word, Hayes arrived at Miller's General Merchandise at precisely 3 o'clock the following afternoon. Rebecca had been ready since 2:30, having changed her outfit twice before settling on a simple but flattering blue dress that Martha assured her brought out the color of her eyes. She had been so distracted during the morning's work that Thomas had gently suggested she take inventory in the storeroom instead of tending to customers. When the shop bell jangled and Hayes stepped inside, Rebecca emerged from the back room with a racing heart. The transformation from the exhausted man of yesterday was remarkable. Clean-shaven, his dark hair neatly combed, and dressed in what appeared to be his Sunday-best dark trousers, a crisp white shirt, and a vest that had clearly been brushed free of dust, Hayes cut an impressive figure that drew appreciative glances from the female customers browsing the store. "Miss Miller," he greeted, hat in hand, "I hope I'm not too early." "Not at all, Mr. Hawkins," Rebecca replied, aware of the curious eyes watching their exchange. "I'm ready whenever you are." Thomas approached from behind the counter, extending his hand to Hayes. "Good to see you looking more rested, Mr. Hawkins. The whole town's talking about the capture of the Barrow gang. You've done us all a great service." Hayes shook Thomas's hand. "Just doing what needed to be done, sir." "Well, don't let me keep you too," Thomas said with a smile. "Rebecca, enjoy your afternoon. Just be home by supper. Martha's making her special chicken and dumplings." Outside, the October afternoon was pleasantly warm, the harsh summer heat having finally given way to the milder temperatures of autumn. Hayes offered Rebecca his arm, which she took with only slight hesitation, hyper-aware of the solid strength beneath the fabric of his sleeve. "Where are we going?" she asked as they strolled down Congress Street. "Thought I'd show you the plaza first," Hayes replied. "Then maybe walk by the Mission. San Xavier del Bac is a bit too far for today, but it's worth visiting sometime. Most beautiful building in the territory." The plaza was bustling with activity vendors selling everything from fruit to handcrafted pottery, children playing games in the shade of mesquite trees, and local musicians performing near the gazebo. Hayes guided Rebecca through the crowd with ease, occasionally stopping to introduce her to people he knew. Rebecca was surprised by how many nodded respectfully to Hayes or greeted him by name, suggesting he was better connected in Tucson than his solitary ranch life might indicate. "You seem to know quite a few people here," Rebecca observed after Hayes had introduced her to a shopkeeper who had insisted on giving them each a piece of freshly made candy. Hayes shrugged slightly. "I come into town every few weeks for supplies, and I've helped the marshal before." "People remember that sort of thing. They respect you," Rebecca said, popping the sweet candy into her mouth. "Respect's important out here," Hayes replied. "A man's word and reputation can mean the difference between life and death sometimes." They continued their walk, the conversation flowing more naturally than Rebecca had anticipated. Hayes proved to be knowledgeable about Tucson's history, pointing out buildings and sharing stories about the town's development from a small Spanish presidio to the growing American settlement it had become. "How did you learn all this?" Rebecca asked as they paused near the old adobe walls that remained from the original fort. "I read a lot," Hayes admitted. "Not much else to do during the long winter evenings at the ranch, and I've always been interested in history, how places change, how people adapt." "That surprises me," Rebecca said without thinking. Hayes raised an eyebrow. "Because cowboys aren't supposed to be readers," Rebecca flushed. "No, that's not what I meant. It's just, you don't seem like someone who dwells in the past. You strike me as very present, forward-looking." Hayes considered this for a moment. "I suppose that's fair, but understanding where we've been helps make sense of where we are and where we might be going." He gestured toward the mission church visible in the distance. "Take that church. Built by Spanish missionaries, decorated by native craftsmen, now standing in American territory, layers of history all visible if you know how to look." Rebecca studied him with growing fascination. "You're not what I expected, Hayes Hawkins." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Is that good or bad?" "Definitely good," she assured him, "though I'm beginning to think there's much more to your story than you've shared." There is, he acknowledged, his expression growing more serious. Some of it not particularly pleasant, but perhaps that's a conversation for another day. They continued walking, eventually finding themselves beside a small creek that ran through a quieter part of town. Cottonwood trees provided welcome shade, and Hayes suggested they sit on a bench overlooking the water. For a few minutes, they simply enjoyed the peaceful setting, watching the play of sunlight on the gentle current. "May I ask you something personal, Rebecca?" Hayes finally broke the silence. "You may ask," she replied with a slight smile. "I reserve the right not to answer if it's too personal." He nodded in acknowledgement of her boundary. "What brought you west, truly? I know you mentioned your parents' passing and your uncle's offer, but many young women in your position might have sought a position in Chicago or married. The journey west isn't an easy one." Rebecca considered the question, appreciating that he seemed genuinely interested rather than merely making conversation. "After my parents died, our house and most of our possessions had to be sold to pay my father's business debts. I discovered that the comfortable life I'd known was built on rather shaky foundations." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I had offers of marriage too, actually. One from my father's business partner's son and another from a widower with 3 small children." "But you declined," Hayes observed. "The first was barely 20 and more interested in whatever small inheritance he thought I might have than in me as a person. The second was kind enough, but—" She trailed off, unsure how to express her feelings without sounding ungrateful. "But you wanted more than security or convenience," Hayes finished for her. Rebecca nodded, surprised by his understanding. "Exactly, I wanted possibility. A chance to build something of my own, to discover who I might be without the constraints of what Chicago society expected of a merchant's daughter. When Uncle Thomas wrote offering me a position in the store with the potential to eventually become a partner in the business, it seemed like an answer to prayers I hadn't even fully articulated." "That takes courage," Hayes said quietly, "leaving everything familiar behind for an uncertain future." "Or desperation," Rebecca countered with a self-deprecating smile, "but I prefer your interpretation." Hayes's gaze was warm as it held hers. "Having seen you face down armed bandits with more composure than most men I know, I'm confident in my assessment of your courage, Miss Miller." A comfortable silence fell between them again, broken only by the gentle sound of the creek and distant church bells marking the hour. "We should start back," Hayes said reluctantly. "I promised your uncle I'd have you home by supper." As they walked back toward the store, their pace was slower than before, each seemingly reluctant for the afternoon to end. When they finally reached Miller's General Merchandise, Hayes stopped at the door, turning to face Rebecca. "Thank you for accompanying me today," he said formally, though his eyes conveyed a warmth that belied the stiffness of his words. "I enjoyed it very much," Rebecca replied honestly. "Will you join us for supper? I'm sure Martha has prepared enough for one more." Hayes shook his head regretfully. "I need to ride back to the ranch tonight. Silas has been handling everything alone for days now, and we have a mare about to foal that needs watching." Disappointment washed through Rebecca, though she tried not to show it. "Of course, your responsibilities come first." "But I'll be back in town on Saturday for the trial," Hayes continued. "All the posse members need to testify, would you? Would you consider attending the harvest dance with me that evening? It's a town tradition, nothing fancy, just music and dancing at the community hall." Rebecca's disappointment vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "I'd be delighted." The smile that spread across Hayes's face made her heart skip. "Saturday, then. I'll come by around 7. Before Rebecca could respond, Hayes took her hand in his touch gentle but firm. For a breathless moment, she thought he might kiss her hand in the European fashion she'd read about in novels. Instead, he simply held it, his thumb brushing lightly across her knuckles in a gesture that felt more intimate than any formal kiss. "Until Saturday, Rebecca," he said softly, releasing her hand and stepping back. "Until Saturday, Hayes," she echoed, her hand still tingling from his touch as she watched him walk away down the busy street. Inside the store, Martha took one look at Rebecca's flushed cheeks and bright eyes and smiled knowingly. Good walk, dear. Very good, Rebecca confirmed, unable to keep the happiness from her voice. And I have plans for Saturday evening. Martha clapped her hands together in delight. The harvest dance. Oh, how wonderful. We'll need to make sure your blue silk is pressed properly, and perhaps we can do something special with your hair. As Martha continued making plans, Rebecca found herself looking forward to Saturday with an anticipation that bordered on giddiness. In just a few short days, her life had transformed from the uncertainty of new beginnings to something unexpected and thrilling, a possibility she hadn't dared to imagine when she'd set out from Chicago seeking a fresh start. And at the center of this transformation stood Hayes Hawkins, the quiet, complex man who had saved more than just her life. He had, perhaps without intending to, awakened her heart. The days leading up to Saturday passed in a blur of activity. Rebecca threw herself into learning the store's operations, eager to prove her value to her uncle and aunt. By Friday, she was confidently handling customer transactions and had reorganized the fabric section in a way that Thomas admitted was much more appealing to the female clientele. News of the Barrow Gang's capture spread throughout the territory, with the Tucson newspaper printing a detailed account that mentioned Hayes by name as one of the key members of the posse. The article described him as a respected rancher and former Army scout whose tracking skills proved instrumental in locating the outlaws' hideout. Reading these words, Rebecca felt a surge of pride, though she kept such feelings private. Saturday morning brought the trial of John Barrow and his men. The courthouse was packed with spectators eager to see justice delivered, and Rebecca slipped in quietly at the back, hoping to observe without drawing attention. Hayes was among several witnesses called to testify. His account of finding Rebecca at the stagecoach station delivered in clear, straightforward terms that nonetheless made her relive those terrifying moments. When the prosecutor asked Hayes to identify the men who had threatened Rebecca, his gaze briefly found hers in the crowd before he pointed to 3 of the defendants with unwavering certainty. The trial proceeded efficiently, with the evidence against the gang overwhelming. By noon, all had been found guilty, with sentencing scheduled for the following week. Few doubted that Barrow and his lieutenants would hang for their crimes. As the courtroom emptied, Rebecca waited outside, hoping to catch a moment with Hayes. When he emerged, deep in conversation with the marshal, she hesitated, not wanting to interrupt official business. Hayes spotted her, however, and excused himself from the marshal to approach her. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, genuine pleasure in his voice. "I wanted to hear what happened," Rebecca explained, "and to support you in my way." Hayes's expression softened. "That means a great deal." He glanced back at the marshal, who was waiting patiently nearby. "I need to finish up some paperwork with Jenkins, but I'll see you tonight as planned." 7 o'clock, Rebecca confirmed with a smile. The rest of the day passed in a flurry of preparation. Martha insisted on helping Rebecca dress for the dance, lending her a delicate cameo brooch that had been her own mother's, and assisting with arranging Rebecca's auburn hair in a style more elaborate than her usual simple bun. The blue silk dress, one of the few fine items Rebecca had brought from Chicago, had been carefully pressed and hung ready. "You look beautiful," Martha declared when the preparations were complete. "Mr. Hawkins won't know what hit him." Rebecca surveyed her reflection in the small mirror, hardly recognizing the elegant young woman who looked back at her. The blue silk complemented her fair complexion and brought out the green of her eyes, while the modest neckline and fitted bodice flattered her slender figure without being inappropriate. "Thank you for your help, Aunt Martha," Rebecca said sincerely. "I'm a bit nervous." Martha patted her hand. "That's perfectly normal, dear, but remember he's already seen you at your worst, dusty and terrified after your ordeal with those bandits. If he was drawn to you then, imagine how he'll feel seeing you like this." The thought was oddly comforting. Hayes had indeed seen her in the most unflattering circumstances possible, yet had still sought her company afterward. Whatever attraction existed between them had begun in the raw authenticity of shared danger, not the artificial setting of a social event where everyone presented only their best selves. When the knock came at exactly 7 o'clock, Rebecca's nerves returned full force. Thomas answered the door while Martha gave Rebecca's appearance one final assessment before nodding in approval. "Mr. Hawkins," Thomas's voice carried from the front room. "Right on time, please come in." Rebecca took a deep breath and entered the room. Hayes stood just inside the door, hat in hand, dressed in what was clearly his finest attire, a dark suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, a crisp white shirt, and a string tie. His hair was neatly combed, and he had shaved close for the occasion. The overall effect was striking the rugged cowboy transformed into a gentleman, though his inherent strength and capability remained evident in his posture and the weathered nature of his hands. When Hayes saw Rebecca, he fell completely still, his expression one of undisguised admiration. "Miss Miller," he finally managed, his voice slightly rougher than usual, "you look extraordinary." Rebecca felt heat rise to her cheeks at the sincerity in his voice. "Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. You look very handsome yourself." Thomas cleared his throat, a hint of amusement in his expression. "Well, you two should be on your way if you want to get a good spot for the dancing. Most of the town will be there tonight." Hayes offered his arm to Rebecca. "Shall we?" The walk to the community hall was brief, but Rebecca treasured every moment of it. Hayes's solid presence beside her felt right in a way she couldn't quite explain, as though they had been walking together for years rather than days. The October evening was pleasantly cool, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky above. "I've been meaning to ask," Rebecca said as they approached the hall, where lanterns were already lit and the sound of a fiddle tuning up could be heard. "How is Sela's, and did the mare have her foal?" Hayes looked surprised and pleased by her question. "Sela's is well, sends his regards, actually." "And yes, the mare delivered a healthy filly 2 nights ago, beautiful little thing with a white blaze on her face." "What will you name her?" Rebecca asked, genuinely interested. Hayes considered for a moment. "Haven't decided yet. Usually wait to see something of their personality before naming them." He glanced down at her with a small smile. "Any suggestions?" The question touched Rebecca unexpectedly. That he would value her input on something so personal to his livelihood felt significant. "Perhaps Esperanza." "It means hope in Spanish." "Esperanza," Hayes repeated, testing the name. "I like that. It suits her. She was born under a full moon, all new possibilities ahead of her." They had reached the hall, which was already filling with townspeople of all ages. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the wooden floor cleared for dancing. At one end, a small group of musicians had assembled: 2 fiddlers, a guitarist, a banjo player, and an older man with a harmonica. Tables laden with refreshments lined the opposite wall, while benches around the perimeter provided seating for those not dancing. Many heads turned as Hayes and Rebecca entered, curious glances and whispered comments following their progress across the room. Rebecca was acutely aware that their appearance together constituted a public statement of sorts in a town this size. By escorting her to the harvest dance, Hayes was declaring his interest in a way that would be understood by everyone present. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. "Would you care for some punch?" Hayes asked, seemingly oblivious to the attention they were receiving. "Yes, thank you," Rebecca replied, grateful for the chance to compose herself. While Hayes fetched their drinks, several women approached Rebecca, introducing themselves as neighbors or regular customers of her uncle's store. Their friendly curiosity was evident in the questions they asked: how she was settling into Tucson, whether she found the desert climate agreeable, and most pointedly, how she had come to know Mr. Hawkins. Rebecca provided polite, brief answers, unwilling to share the full dramatic story of their meeting with casual acquaintances. When Hayes returned with 2 cups of punch, the women dispersed with knowing smiles and promises to chat more later, making friends already. Hayes asked, handing her a cup, attempting to satisfy curiosity more like. Rebecca replied with a small laugh. "I believe we're something of a spectacle this evening." Hayes glanced around, noticing the occasional stares. Small towns, he said with a resigned shake of his head. Everyone knows everyone's business or wants to, at least. Does it bother you? Rebecca asked, suddenly concerned that Hayes might regret the public nature of their outing. Not at all, he assured her, his gaze direct and honest. Let them talk if they want. I'm exactly where I want to be, with exactly the person I want to be with. The simple declaration sent warmth spreading through Rebecca's chest. Before she could respond, the music started in earnest, a lively reel that immediately drew several couples to the dance floor. Hayes set aside their empty cups and extended his hand. May I have this dance, Miss Miller? Rebecca placed her hand in his, excitement and nervousness mingling in her stomach. You may, Mr. Hawkins, though I should warn you it's been some time since I've danced. Hayes's smile was reassuring. Just follow my lead. I promise not to steer you wrong. To Rebecca's surprise, Hayes proved to be an excellent dancer, guiding her through the steps with confidence and grace that belied his frontier occupation. His hand at her waist was firm but respectful, his movements smooth as they navigated the increasingly crowded floor. Where did you learn to dance like this? Rebecca asked as they completed a particularly complex turn without missing a step. My mother insisted, Hayes replied, a fond memory softening his expression. Said no son of hers would grow up without knowing how to properly escort a lady at a social gathering. She taught piano to supplement the family income and traded lessons for dance instruction from a retired performer who had settled in our town. She sounds like a remarkable woman, Rebecca observed. She was, Hayes agreed. Would have liked you, I think. She valued independence and intelligence in women, traits you possess in abundance. The compliment warmed Rebecca as much as the exertion of dancing. When the music ended, they were both slightly breathless, and Hayes suggested they step outside for some fresh air. The night had grown cooler, and only a few other couples had ventured onto the small porch that wrapped around the community hall. Hayes removed his jacket and placed it gently around Rebecca's shoulders without asking, the gesture both protective and intimate. The weight of it felt comforting, and his scent clean soap, leather, and something uniquely him enveloped her. Better, he asked as they stood at the railing, gazing up at the star-filled sky. Much, Rebecca confirmed. Thank you for bringing me tonight. I'm enjoying myself tremendously. As am I, Hayes said quietly. More than I expected to, if I'm being honest. Rebecca turned to face him, curious. You didn't expect to enjoy the dance, Hayes considered his words carefully. I'm not much for social gatherings usually. Prefer the quiet of the ranch, the company of horses, and a few good men who work the land alongside me. He paused, his gaze meeting hers in the dim light. But being here with you, it's different, better. The honesty in his voice touched something deep within Rebecca. I know what you mean, she admitted. Since arriving in Tucson, I've felt like I was playing a part, the grateful niece, the eager new shopkeeper, the Eastern girl adapting to Western ways. But with you, I feel real, like myself. Hayes moved slightly closer, his hand finding hers on the railing. Rebecca, he began, his voice low and serious. I need to tell you something before this goes any further. A flicker of apprehension passed through her. What is it, my past? It's complicated. I've done things I'm not proud of, especially during the war and after. His expression was solemn, almost grave. I've killed men not just in self-defense or to protect others, like with the Barrow Gang. I was a scout for the army during some of the worst fighting with the Apache. I led soldiers to villages, knowing what would happen when they arrived. Rebecca remained silent, sensing he needed to continue without interruption. After I left the army, I drifted for a while. Took work that wasn't always on the right side of the law, never outright robbery or murder, but guiding people to places they shouldn't go, helping them find ways around the rules. He looked away, jaw tight. It took losing someone important to me to realize the path I was on. Winning the ranch was a second chance I probably didn't deserve. He turned back to her, his eyes searching her face for judgment. I'm not that man anymore, haven't been for years, but that history is part of me, and anyone who cares for me should know it. Rebecca considered his words carefully, understanding the courage it took to share such truths. Thank you for telling me, she said finally. We all have parts of our past we wish we could change. What matters is who you've chosen to become. Hayes studied her face, seeming to search for any sign of disillusionment or disgust. Finding none, some of the tension eased from his shoulders. "You're remarkably understanding." "Not remarkable," Rebecca countered. "Just human. My own past isn't without regrets, though mine are certainly less dramatic than yours." She paused, gathering her courage. "I care about you, Hayes, more than I probably should after knowing you such a short time. But I do, and nothing you've just told me changes that." The vulnerability in Hayes's expression shifted to something warmer, more hopeful. His hand tightened around hers. "Rebecca," he said, her name almost a caress on his lips. "May I kiss you?" The directness of the question sent a thrill through her. "Yes," she whispered. Hayes moved closer, one hand gently cupping her cheek while the other remained entwined with hers on the railing. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to change her mind, he lowered his head until his lips met hers in a kiss that began tenderly but quickly deepened with a hunger that surprised them both. Rebecca had been kissed before chaste, proper kisses from suitors in Chicago, but nothing had prepared her for the rush of emotion and desire that flooded through her at Hayes's touch. His hand slid from her cheek to the nape of her neck, cradling her head as the kiss continued, his other arm moving to encircle her waist and draw her closer. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Hayes rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since the moment I saw you step out of your room at the ranch," he confessed, his voice husky. Rebecca's laugh was soft and a bit shaky. "Even covered in dust and terrified, even then," Hayes confirmed. "Maybe especially then. You were the bravest, most beautiful woman I'd ever seen." A discreet cough from the doorway interrupted the moment. They stepped apart quickly to find an older couple watching them with poorly concealed amusement. "Evening, Mr. and Mrs. Peterson," Hayes greeted, his composure returning faster than Rebecca's. "Mr. Hawkins," the man replied with a knowing smile. "Miss Miller, fine night for stargazing, isn't it?" "Indeed it is, sir," Hayes agreed smoothly. "Though I believe the music is calling us back inside, if you'll excuse us." He guided Rebecca past the couple and back into the hall, his hand warm at the small of her back. "I apologize," he murmured once they were out of earshot. "That was inappropriate of me, out in the open like that." "I was a willing participant," Rebecca reminded him, still feeling the ghost of his kiss on her lips. Hayes's expression grew serious. "Even so, I respect you too much to risk your reputation. From now on, I'll be more careful." The promise both touched and frustrated Rebecca. She understood the necessity of propriety, especially in a small town where gossip traveled faster than telegrams, but part of her wished they could be free to express their growing feelings without such constraints. They rejoined the dancing for several more songs, their movements now charged with a new awareness of each other. When it came time for Hayes to escort Rebecca home, they walked slowly, reluctant for the evening to end. At her uncle's door, Hayes maintained a respectable distance, mindful of his earlier promise. "I had a wonderful time," Rebecca said, removing his jacket from her shoulders and returning it to him with genuine reluctance. "As did I," Hayes replied, his eyes conveying what he didn't say aloud. "When can I see you again? Uncle Thomas gives me Sundays off from the store," Rebecca suggested. "Perhaps we could attend church services together and afterward." "I'd like that," Hayes agreed quickly. "I'll come by at 9 tomorrow morning if that suits you." "It does." Rebecca hesitated, then added impulsively, "I'm glad you saved my life, Hayes Hawkins." His smile was tender. "Best thing I ever did, as it turns out." He took her hand, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles in a gesture that somehow felt even more intimate than their earlier embrace. "Good night, Rebecca. Sweet dreams." "Good night, Hayes," she replied softly, watching as he descended the stairs and disappeared into the night. Inside, Rebecca leaned against the closed door, her heart full to bursting with emotions she was only beginning to understand. Whatever this was between them, this connection that had formed so quickly and burned so brightly, it felt real and significant in a way nothing in her life had before. As she prepared for bed, Rebecca's thoughts drifted to the future. She had come west seeking independence and possibility. Instead, she had found Hayes Hawkins and with him, the promise of something she hadn't even known she was looking for. The weeks that followed were among the happiest of Rebecca's life. True to his word, Hayes arrived promptly at 9 the next morning to escort her to church services, his appearance causing a stir among the congregation that confirmed what Rebecca already suspected: Hayes Hawkins rarely attended Sunday worship. His presence beside her was a statement in itself, one that didn't go unnoticed by the town's more observant residents. After church, they began a pattern that would define their courtship: long walks together, occasional picnics when weather permitted, and suppers with Thomas and Martha where the conversation flowed easily and laughter was frequent. Hayes proved to be a thoughtful, attentive suitor, bringing small gifts that showed his careful observation of Rebecca's preferences: a ribbon in her favorite shade of green, a book of poetry he'd noticed her admiring in the general store, wildflowers gathered on his ride into town. November arrived with cooler temperatures and preparations for Thanksgiving. Hayes invited Rebecca, along with Thomas and Martha, to celebrate the holiday at his ranch. The invitation represented a significant step in their relationship, introducing Rebecca to his home and daily life beyond the brief, dramatic glimpse she'd had during their first meeting. The ranch, seen in daylight and without the haze of exhaustion and fear, impressed Rebecca deeply. What had seemed a modest homestead in the darkness revealed itself to be a well-organized, prosperous operation. The main house, though simple, was larger than she'd initially realized, with a spacious kitchen, comfortable living areas, and enough bedrooms to accommodate the entire Miller family with room to spare. Hayes showed her his stables with obvious pride, introducing her to each horse by name, including the new foal Esperanza, who had indeed grown into her name, spirited and full of promise. "This is a wonderful place, Hayes," Rebecca said sincerely as they stood on the porch after the Thanksgiving meal, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. Thomas and Martha were inside with Silas, enjoying coffee and the last of Martha's pumpkin pie. "You've built something meaningful here." Hayes's arm rested comfortably around her shoulders, a liberty that had become acceptable now that their courtship was well established and conducted with proper respect for convention. "It's taken years of hard work," he acknowledged. "But yes, I'm proud of what Silas and I have accomplished." He paused, his expression growing more serious. I hope you could see yourself here, someday." The implication of his words sent a warm flutter through Rebecca's chest. "I could," she admitted quietly, "very easily." Hayes turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "Rebecca, I know it's only been a few weeks, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you. I think I started falling in love with you the moment I saw you standing so brave against those bandits, and every day since has only deepened those feelings." Rebecca's heart soared at his declaration. "I love you too, Hayes. It happened so quickly, but it feels more real than anything I've ever known." Hayes brought her hands to his lips, kissing them reverently. "I want to ask you properly with a ring and your uncle's blessing, but I needed to know first if my feelings were returned." "They are," Rebecca assured him, her eyes shining with unshed tears of happiness. "With all my heart." Their kiss was tender and filled with promise, a sealing of the words they had just exchanged. When they returned inside, hand in hand, something in their expressions must have revealed the shift in their relationship. For Martha gave Rebecca a knowing smile, and Thomas cleared his throat in a manner that suggested he anticipated a serious conversation in the near future. 2 days later, Hayes called at the Miller's home at an hour when he knew Rebecca would be working at the store. His conversation with Thomas was private, but when Rebecca returned home that evening, her uncle's warm embrace and Martha's barely contained excitement told her all she needed to know. The following Sunday, after church services, Hayes took Rebecca for a drive in his buggy, heading out of town toward a scenic overlook that provided a spectacular view of the valley. There, with the winter sun warming the desert landscape, he knelt before her and presented a small velvet box. "Rebecca Miller," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes, "you came into my life unexpectedly, but now I can't imagine my future without you in it. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" The ring inside the box was beautiful, a modest but perfect diamond flanked by two small sapphires that reminded Rebecca of the Arizona sky. "Yes," she whispered, tears of joy spilling onto her cheeks. "Yes, Hayes, I will marry you." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Rebecca felt a sense of rightness that transcended the whirlwind nature of their courtship. Some matches were made over years of careful consideration, but others, it seemed, were forged in moments of crisis and cemented through the discovery of a deeper connection that defied conventional timelines. They agreed on a February wedding, enough time for proper preparations, but not so long that they would have to endure an extended engagement. The announcement in the Tucson newspaper sparked a flurry of congratulations and well wishes from townspeople who had followed their courtship with interest. Martha threw herself into wedding plans with enthusiasm, while Thomas set aside a portion of the store's storeroom for gifts that began arriving from friends and business associates. Hayes, meanwhile, started renovations on the ranch house, adding a proper bathroom with indoor plumbing and redecorating the master bedroom with new furniture ordered from back east. As Christmas approached, Rebecca divided her time between helping at the increasingly busy store and preparing for her new life as Mrs. Hayes Hawkins. She and Martha sewed linens for her trousseau, while Hayes and Thomas collaborated on building a beautiful hope chest as a surprise Christmas gift. The holiday itself was a joyous affair, celebrated at the Millers' home with Hayes and Silas as honored guests. Gifts were exchanged, carols sung around Martha's prized piano, and the evening concluded with Hayes and Rebecca stealing a few private moments on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the December chill. "Hard to believe that just a few months ago I didn't even know you existed," Hayes mused, his arm secure around Rebecca's waist as they gazed at the star-filled sky. "Now I can't remember what my life was like before you." Rebecca leaned her head against his shoulder, contentment filling her. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been if you hadn't tracked the Barrow gang to that stagecoach station? If you'd arrived a day earlier or later?" Hayes tightened his hold on her. "I try not to, the thought of what might have happened to you." He shook his head, unable to complete the sentence. "Let's just say I'm grateful every day that I was there at the right moment." "As am I," Rebecca agreed softly, "though I like to think we might have found each other anyway somehow, that we were meant to meet one way or another." Hayes smiled down at her, his expression tender in the moonlight. "I never thought much about fate or destiny before you, Rebecca Miller, but now I'm inclined to believe in both." Their wedding day dawned clear and surprisingly warm for February. The small church was filled to capacity with well-wishers, ranchers, and townspeople, alike coming to witness the union of the respected horseman and the shopkeeper's niece, whose dramatic first meeting had become something of a local legend. Rebecca wore a gown of ivory silk that Martha had helped her design and sew, with lace at the collar and cuffs that had once adorned her mother's wedding dress. Hayes cut a striking figure in a new black suit, his usually tanned face slightly pale with what Thomas assured him was perfectly normal pre-wedding nervousness. When Rebecca appeared at the church door on her uncle's arm, Hayes's expression transformed from anxiety to awe. Their eyes locked across the crowded room, and in that moment, everything else faded away: the guests, the decorations, even the minister waiting at the altar. There was only Hayes and Rebecca and the journey that had brought them to this moment. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, their vows spoken with clear voices that carried to the last pew. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Hayes's kiss was respectfully restrained given their audience, but his eyes promised more when they were finally alone. The celebration afterward at the community hall lasted well into the evening, with dancing, speeches, and enough food to feed half the territory. As the festivities wound down, Hayes and Rebecca slipped away to begin the short journey to the ranch to their home. They traveled in comfortable silence, Rebecca nestled against Hayes's side in the buggy, her head on his shoulder and his arm securely around her. The stars were brilliant overhead, the desert night alive with subtle sounds that had become familiar to Rebecca over the past months. When they arrived at the ranch, lights blazed welcome from the windows Silas's doing, ensuring the house would be warm and inviting for their return. Hayes helped Rebecca down from the buggy, but instead of leading her inside, he swept her into his arms in a fluid motion that drew a surprised laugh from her. "What are you doing?" she asked, her arms automatically encircling his neck. "Carrying my bride across the threshold," Hayes replied with a smile. "It's tradition." "Is it?" Rebecca teased. "Or just an excuse to show off your strength?" Hayes's laugh was low and warm against her ear, maybe a little of both. Inside, the house had been transformed. Fresh flowers graced every surface, a fire crackled in the hearth, and a bottle of champagne, a luxury in these parts, waited in a bucket of ice beside two crystal glasses that Rebecca recognized as part of their wedding gifts. Hayes set her gently on her feet but kept his arms around her waist. "Welcome home, Mrs. Hawkins," he murmured, the new name sending a thrill through Rebecca. "I like the sound of that," she admitted, looking up at him with love and anticipation mingling in her gaze. Hayes brushed a tendril of hair from her face, his touch lingering on her cheek. "So do I." His expression grew more serious, though his eyes remained warm. "Rebecca, I want you to know I understand this is all new for you. We have all the time in the world. There's no rush for anything." The consideration behind his words touched her deeply. "Thank you," she said softly. "But Hayes, I'm not afraid, not with you." She reached up to touch his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw. "I want to be your wife in every way." The restraint in Hayes's expression gave way to unmistakable desire. He lowered his head to capture her lips in a kiss that held none of the public reserve of their previous embraces. This was a husband's kiss, passionate, claiming, and filled with promise. When they finally parted, both breathless, Hayes rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Rebecca Hawkins," he whispered, "more than I ever thought possible." "And I love you," she replied, her heart so full it felt it might burst, "now and always." As Hayes led her toward their bedroom, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had left Chicago seeking independence and possibility, never imagining that her path would cross with a cowboy who would save her life in more ways than one. What had begun in danger and desperation had blossomed into the deepest love she had ever known, a love that promised a future brighter and more fulfilling than anything she could have envisioned for herself. Sometimes, Rebecca realized, the greatest adventures began in the most unexpected circumstances. And sometimes, the bravest decision wasn't facing down bandits or traveling across the country alone. It was opening your heart to the possibility of love, even when it arrived in the most dramatic and unlikely of ways. 5 years later, Rebecca stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching as Hayes taught their 4-year-old son, Thomas, to sit properly on his first pony. Her hand rested protectively on her swollen belly, where their second child, a daughter, she was certain would make her appearance in less than 2 months. The ranch had prospered under their joint care. Hayes's reputation for breeding and training the finest horses in the territory had grown, while Rebecca had applied her business acumen to expanding their operations to include cattle as well. The small garden she had noticed on her first visit had multiplied into productive fields that provided food for their table and additional income at the Tucson market. Silas still lived with them, now more family than employee, delighting in his role as honorary grandfather to young Thomas. Thomas and Martha Miller visited regularly from town, where they continued to run the general store with the help of a young couple who would eventually take over the business when they retired. As Rebecca watched her husband's patient instruction and her son's determined concentration, contentment washed over her. Their life wasn't without challenges: drought years, difficult births among the horses, the occasional dispute with neighboring ranchers, but they faced each obstacle together, their partnership strengthening with every trial overcome. Hayes looked up, catching her eye across the corral. His smile, still capable of making her heart skip after all these years, broadened as he lifted Thomas from the pony and set him on his shoulders. "Mama," Thomas called excitedly as they approached, "I stayed on all by myself." "I saw," Rebecca confirmed, reaching up to ruffle his dark hair so like his father's. "You're becoming quite the horseman." Hayes set Thomas down gently. "Go help Silas feed the chickens, son, then wash up for supper." As Thomas scampered off toward the coop where Silas was already distributing feed, Hayes turned his full attention to Rebecca. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his hand joining hers on her rounded belly. "Wonderful," Rebecca replied honestly. "Though your daughter has been particularly active today." Hayes raised an eyebrow. "Still convinced it's a girl, absolutely certain," Rebecca nodded. "A strong-willed daughter who will have you wrapped around her finger from the moment she arrives." Hayes laughed, pulling Rebecca carefully into his embrace. "Like mother, like daughter, then." He placed a gentle kiss on her forehead. "Have I told you today how much I love you, MMM? Not since breakfast," Rebecca teased, leaning into his strength. "I might need reminding." Hayes's expression grew tender as he gazed down at her. "I love you, Rebecca Hawkins, more with each passing day." "And I love you," she replied, the words as true now as they had been on their wedding day. "My heroic cowboy." A small movement beneath their joined hands interrupted the moment, their unborn child making her presence known. Hayes knelt to press a gentle kiss to Rebecca's belly, murmuring words of love to their daughter. Rising again, he wrapped his arm around Rebecca's shoulders as they turned to watch the sunset painting the desert in gold and crimson. In the distance, a lone rider approached, likely one of their ranch hands returning from town with the mail and supplies. The scene was peaceful, ordinary, and perfect in its simplicity. This was the life they had built together, a life that had begun in a moment of terror but had transformed into something beautiful and enduring. Rebecca leaned her head against Hayes's shoulder, gratitude filling her heart. Sometimes the journey to happiness took unexpected turns, and sometimes salvation came in forms you never anticipated. For Rebecca Miller Hawkins, it had come in the form of a cowboy who had fired first and ridden away with her safe not just from physical danger, but toward a future filled with love, family, and the kind of contentment she had once only dreamed might be possible. And as the sun sank below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land they both loved, Rebecca knew with absolute certainty that some stories didn't end with the rescue sometimes. That was precisely where they began.